A year after my marriage ended, I received a message from the woman my husband had been cheating with. It was 3 words long. It said simply, "You saved me." Not "I'm sorry." Not "I never meant to hurt you." Just "You saved me." And the strangest part of this whole story, a story that began with the worst betrayal of my life, is that she was right. I had. Because the text she sent me by mistake, the one that was supposed to be the bomb that destroyed my marriage, turned out to be the best mistake she ever made in her life. It didn't just end my husband's affair. It ended his entire double life. It pulled a woman back from the edge of losing everything she had, and it showed the two of us, in the same week, exactly what kind of man we had both been loving. I'm going to tell you this story the way it actually happened backwards, from a thank you to the single mistaken text that caused it. Because to understand why the other woman ended up thanking me, you first have to understand what she had no idea she was being saved from. But before I do, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. If the person your partner was cheating with turned out to be just as deceived as you were, would you be able to see her as a fellow victim instead of the enemy? Or is that a bridge too far? Be honest. There's no wrong answer. I wasn't sure I could do it myself until the moment came. Tell me in the comments where you land. I read every single one. And before I go back to the beginning, I want to say something to anyone watching who is sitting in the wreckage of this exact discovery right now. The instinct to hate the other person is natural, and I'm not going to tell you it's wrong to feel it. But I am going to ask you to hold off on aiming it until you actually know the shape of what happened. Sometimes she knew everything and chose it, and your anger is hers to absorb. But sometimes she was handed the same lie you were, in a different envelope. You don't have to decide tonight. You don't have to forgive anyone. Just stay curious a little longer than your pain wants you to. Because the truth about who actually did this to you is worth getting right. Aiming your anger at the wrong person is its own kind of second wound. So let me take you back to the mistake. The text. It arrived on an ordinary, forgettable evening while my husband Scott was in the shower. His phone was on the counter, and mine was beside it, and they had the same case. Because we'd bought them together a small, stupid domestic detail that turned out to change everything. A message lit up the screen, and because I am a human being and the screen was facing me, I glanced down and read the preview, fully expecting it to be something forgettable, a delivery, a reminder, nothing. It was from a number I didn't know, saved in his phone under a name I didn't recognize, Emily. And the message said, "I can't keep doing this sneaking around. When are you finally going to tell her you're leaving? You promised me by the summer." I love you, Scott. I want you to notice something about that message, because I noticed it even in the first shock of reading it. And it's the thread that unravels the entire story. She wasn't writing like a mistress having a fling. She was writing like a woman who believed she was in a real relationship with a man who had promised her a future. When are you finally going to tell her you're leaving? She thought Scott was leaving me. She thought she was the next chapter, not the dirty secret hidden between the pages. That single line told me, before I knew anything else, that Emily was not the villain of this story. She was another character in the same con. I have replayed that first reading 100 times, and what strikes me now is how my brain tried to protect me from the obvious for a few seconds. The mind does a strange thing when it sees something it can't bear. It looks for an innocent explanation first. A wrong number. A coworker's joke. Some misunderstanding I could explain away and go back to my ordinary evening. But the words wouldn't let me. When are you finally going to tell her you're leaving? There is no innocent reading of that sentence. And underneath the betrayal, almost immediately, I felt something I did not expect to feel toward the woman who'd sent it. I felt a flicker of recognition. Because the desperation in that message, the begging, the believing, the I love you tacked on at the end like a prayer that was the sound of someone being strung along. I knew that sound. I'd been hearing a quieter version of it in my own marriage for a while without naming it. She wasn't gloating about taking my husband. She was pleading with him to keep a promise. Pleading people are not winning. They're being managed. Here is the thing. Though Emily had not meant to send that text to me, she'd meant to send it to Scott. But she had typed in the wrong contact, or her phone had suggested the wrong one, or some tiny digital accident had occurred, and her most private, most vulnerable message, the one begging the man she loved to finally choose her, had gone to the one person on earth it could do the most damage to. The wife. Me, I think about the odds of it sometimes, how a relationship built so carefully on secrecy, on separation, on never letting the two worlds touch, was undone by a single mistap on a glowing screen. Scott had been so careful for so long. He'd had 2 phones worth of caution, 2 sets of stories, 2 carefully maintained realities. And none of it mattered. In the end, against one tired woman typing a heartfelt message late in the evening and her thumb landing one name too high or too low in a contact list. That's the thing about lives built on lies. They require perfect maintenance, forever, from everyone involved, including the people who don't even know they're maintaining them. One slip anywhere in the machine, and the whole thing seizes. Scott had spent years assuming the slip would never come. It came from the person he trusted to keep his secret as desperately as he did. If your heart is pounding imagining reading that text, hold on, because what I did next is the part that surprised even me. But first, do me one quick favor. Tap like and subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking for nothing. These calm revenge stories get buried by the algorithm unless people actually engage, and your one tap is the only reason the next one reaches a woman who is, tonight, holding her partner's phone and feeling the floor tilt. And believe me, the choice I made about that mistaken text is the whole reason this story ends with a thank you instead of a war. Because here is what I did not do. I did not march into the bathroom and throw the phone at him. I did not scream. I did not, in that first hot rush of betrayal, do the thing every instinct was begging me to do. Instead, I did something that felt almost unnatural. I took a photo of the message with my own phone. I put his phone back exactly where it had been, screen down, as if I'd never seen it. And when Scott came out of the shower, I said goodnight, and I went to bed beside him. And I lay there in the dark with my heart going like a drum, and I thought, very clearly, for a very long time. And what I kept coming back to was that one line. She thought he was leaving me. That night, lying in the dark next to him, I did a kind of accounting I'd never let myself do before. Because the text didn't just reveal an affair. It reread the last 2 years of my marriage for me, all at once, like subtitles suddenly appearing under a film I thought I'd understood. The nights he'd been working late, the new password on his phone, the way he'd grown both more distant and, oddly, more performatively affectionate, as though he were paying down guilt in small installments. The trips, the stress. Every strange little moment I had explained away to keep my world intact suddenly had a different, truer explanation, and they all pointed the same direction. I didn't cry that night, not really. I was too busy understanding. There's a particular clarity that comes at 2 a.m. when the lie finally has a shape, and I lay there assembling that shape piece by piece. And by the time the sky started to lighten, I knew 2 things for certain: that my marriage was over, and that I was not going to let him control how it ended. Which meant Emily had been lied to, exactly as I had been lied to, by the exact same man, at the exact same time. We were not rivals. We were 2 halves of the same deception. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the most powerful thing I could possibly do was not to attack the other woman. It was to find her, and to tell her the truth. But I am careful by nature, and I wanted to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with before I did anything. So over the next several days, I quietly learned what I could. And what I found made my stomach turn, because Emily's situation was so much worse than mine. I was being cheated on. That's terrible. But I was at least financially independent and clear-eyed about who Scott legally was. Emily was something else. From what I could piece together, Scott had told Emily that he and I were already basically separated, that we were living as roommates. That the marriage was a formality he was handling. That he just needed a little more time to extract himself cleanly. He had told her he loved her, that they had a future, and this was the part that made it urgent. She had begun reorganizing her entire life around that promise. She was, I came to understand, on the verge of major decisions. The kind you don't come back from easily. She was about to give this man things, and change things, and commit things, based entirely on a future he had no intention of ever giving her. She wasn't his mistress. She was his mark. And the clock was running. I need to sit on this distinction for a moment, because it reframed the entire situation for me, and it might for you too. There is a difference between a person who knowingly steps into an affair with a married man, eyes open, aware of the wife, aware of the wrong, and a person who is told a careful, sustained lie designed to make them believe no wife stands in the way at all. The first is a participant. The second is a victim. Emily believed she was loving a man who was nearly free. She believed the marriage was a finished thing being formally wrapped up. She had no idea she was the secret. She thought she was the future. Scott had engineered her belief as deliberately as he'd engineered mine. He'd told me one story to keep me calm and asleep, and told her the opposite story to keep her hopeful and waiting, and the only way either story worked was if we never, ever met. Realizing that didn't make my pain smaller, but it pointed my anger at the right person, and there is enormous power in aiming your anger correctly. Most betrayed people waste years firing at the other woman. The architect walks away clean while the two people he deceived tear into each other. I decided I was not going to give Scott that gift. That changed everything for me. Because suddenly this wasn't only about my marriage. There was a real chance that if I stayed silent, if I just quietly divorced Scott and walked away to protect my own dignity, Emily would walk straight off a cliff he had built for her, never knowing the ground wasn't there. I could not do that. Whatever Emily was to my marriage, she was a woman being deceived by a practiced liar. And I had the truth that could save her. The question was only how to give it to her in a way she would actually believe. Because the hardest thing in the world is to convince someone that the person they love is lying to them. I knew this because I had just lived it from the inside. Even with the text sitting in my own hand, even with the evidence glowing on my own screen, some stubborn, loyal part of me had spent that first night looking for the exit, the explanation, the way it could all still not be true. If it was that hard for me, holding proof, how much harder would it be for Emily, who had every emotional reason to disbelieve a wife and every romantic investment in the man's innocence? Scott had spent months building her trust in him and her suspicion of me. I couldn't out-argue that. Argument would only trigger her defenses. The only thing that could possibly work was the opposite of argument. Calm, no pressure, no accusation, just the quiet evidence laid down on a table with the freedom for her to examine it herself and reach her own conclusion. You cannot push the truth into someone. You can only set it down in front of them, gently, and give them room to walk toward it. That, I decided, was the only approach that had a chance. So here is how I did it, and it is the calmest, strangest, most important thing I have ever done in my life. I reached out to Emily. Not with rage, not with stay away from my husband. I sent her a short, careful message that said, essentially, I'm Scott's wife. I think you and I have both been told a very different story about the same man, and I don't think either of us is the villain here. I'm not angry at you. I think you may be in more danger than you know, and I'd like to show you what I've seen, and then you can decide for yourself what's true. No demands, no accusations, just an open door and the truth waiting on the other side of it. She almost didn't answer me at all. She told me later that her first instinct was that I was a jealous wife trying to manipulate her, which is exactly what Scott had preloaded her to think. He'd told her I was bitter and controlling and would say anything. That's the oldest move in the con artist's book. Poison the well in advance, so that when the truth arrives wearing the wife's face, the victim won't drink it. But something in the calm of my message reached her, and she agreed to meet. I almost lost my nerve a dozen times before that meeting. I want to be honest about that, because from the outside this all sounds very composed, and inside it was anything but. There were moments I thought, why am I doing this? Why am I going out of my way to help the woman my husband was sleeping with, when I could just quietly divorce him and never look back, and let her find out the hard way like everyone else does? That would have been easier. It would have been, in a small, ugly way, satisfying. But every time I imagined actually doing it, actually staying silent, and letting her walk into the trap, I couldn't. Because I kept thinking, if our situations were reversed, if I were the one being lied to about a separation that wasn't real, about to give my whole life to a fiction, I would have wanted someone to tell me. I would have wanted the truth more than I wanted my comfortable illusion. So I decided to be the person I would have wanted. That decision, more than anything else in this story, is the one I'm proudest of. We met in a coffee shop in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, two women who had every cultural reason to hate each other, sitting down across a small table. And I did not perform. I did not cry or accuse. I simply laid out, gently and factually, what was true. That Scott and I were not separated, not living as roommates, not anything close to it. That the marriage he'd described to her as a dead formality was, as far as I had known until a week ago, an ordinary living marriage. I showed her carefully enough to prove I was telling the truth and not spinning a story, the quiet, undramatic evidence of a real current marriage that Scott had erased from his version. And I watched the truth land on Emily's face in real time. And it was one of the most painful things I have ever witnessed. Because she was not a villain. She was a woman discovering, in a coffee shop, that the future she'd built her heart around had never existed. I will never forget the way her hands shook around the coffee cup. She didn't argue with me, that was the thing. Part of me had braced for her to lash out, to call me a liar, to defend him. But she didn't, and I understood why, somewhere underneath the hope she had already known. People being conned almost always feel the wrongness long before they admit it. There's a small voice that keeps asking the questions the heart keeps overriding. When the dates kept slipping, when by the summer became by the fall, when every concrete step toward the future he promised somehow always got postponed. She'd been silencing that voice for months because she loved him and because doubting him felt like disloyalty. And now here I was, a stranger, saying out loud the thing her own instincts had been whispering. The truth didn't shock her so much as it released her. You could see it happen, the terrible relief of finally being allowed to believe what you already suspected. She was quiet for a long time. And then, she said the thing that became the seed of everything that followed. She said, "He told me you were the liar." And I said, "He told me you didn't exist." And in that single exchange, the entire con collapsed. Because the two people Scott had kept carefully separated, each fed a different fiction, were finally sitting at the same table comparing notes, which is the one thing a man living a double life can never, ever allow to happen. I want to underline that. Because it's the strategic heart of this entire story, and it applies far beyond my marriage. A double life is not actually held together by lies. It's held together by separation, by keeping the deceived parties in different rooms, different stories, different realities that are never allowed to touch. The lies are just the walls between the rooms. Scott could tell me one thing and Emily the opposite, indefinitely, as long as the two of us never sat at the same table. The moment we did, he didn't have to be caught in any single lie. The contradiction caught him automatically. My story and her story simply could not both be true, and there we were, both true, side by side. He had spent enormous energy maintaining those walls, and it turned out the walls were the only thing holding him up. Knock down the separation, and the whole structure falls without anyone even having to push it. What happened after that was not a dramatic revenge plot. It was something quieter and far more devastating to a man like Scott. Emily and I did not become best friends that would be too neat, and life isn't that tidy. But we became, for a brief and important time, allies in the truth. We compared the two stories he'd told, side by side, the calm story and the hopeful one. We each understood, finally, the full architecture of the lie. And then, we each, separately, did the only thing that truth ever really requires. We stopped participating in the fiction. For me, that meant a calm, prepared divorce. By the time Scott had any idea that his two worlds had touched. I had already spoken to a lawyer, organized what I needed, and protected myself completely. I didn't need a screaming confrontation. I had something better. Certainty, documentation, and absolutely no illusions left for him to exploit. That phrase, no illusions left for him to exploit, is the quiet key to the whole divorce. Because a man like Scott doesn't win confrontations by being right. He wins them by managing your feelings, by making you doubt yourself, by offering a sliver of hope, by reframing his betrayal as a misunderstanding, by being so practiced at the emotional sleight of hand that you walk away apologizing for your own anger. I had watched him do versions of this for years without recognizing it. But you cannot run that game on someone who has already seen the whole board. Every soothing thing he might have said, I now knew the function of. Every reframe I could see coming. The text, and then Emily, had stripped me of exactly the thing he needed me to have, which was uncertainty. A betrayed spouse who is uncertain is clay in a manipulator's hands. A betrayed spouse who is certain is a closed door. I had become a closed door, and there is nothing a man like Scott can do with a closed door except finally, for once, deal with the truth on the other side of it. So when I finally sat Scott down and told him I knew everything not just about the affair, but about the elaborate lie he'd told Emily, I watched a man realize that both of his carefully separated lives had ended in the same week, and that there was nothing left to manage, because the one thing his whole double life depended on was each woman not knowing about the other. And now we both knew everything. For Emily, it meant something even more important. It meant she did not make the irreversible decisions she had been about to make. It meant she kept her life, her stability, her savings, her sense of herself, all the things she had been about to quietly hand over to a man who would have taken them and, in time, disappeared to do it to someone else. The mistaken text, the one she sent in a careless second, to the wrong contact. The one she must have stared at in horror when she realized where it had gone turned out to be the thing that saved her from the worst mistake of all. Sending it to me felt, in the moment she realized it, like the worst catastrophe imaginable. It was actually a rescue in disguise. That is why, a year later, she sent me 3 words. You saved me. But I have come to believe she had it slightly wrong, and I told her so. I didn't save her. The truth saved her. I just refused to stand between her and it. That's all any of us can really do for each other when someone we both trusted turns out to be a liar. Refuse to hold the wall up on his behalf. Refuse to play the rival he cast us as. and let the truth do what truth does when it's finally allowed in the same room as the people it concerns. Anyone can do that. It doesn't take courage so much as it takes a decision. The decision to want the truth more than you want to win. And the truth is, we saved each other. Because if she had never sent that text by mistake, I might have spent years longer married to a man living a secret life, and she might have given everything to a future made of fog. One wrong contact, one fumbled message, and two women who were meant to be enemies accidentally handed each other the truth instead. The universe has a strange sense of justice sometimes. It hid the most important truth of our lives inside the clumsiest possible accident. Scott, for the record, ended up with neither of us, and with a reputation that traveled exactly as far as a story like that travels. There is no version of a double life that survives the two halves meeting. None. It is the single, unfixable vulnerability of every person who tries to love two people in two separate sealed rooms. The day the rooms connect, there is no story left to tell. He had built his whole comfortable deception on the certainty that we would never compare notes. A single mistaken text destroyed that certainty forever. And if you'll let me leave you with one thing, not as someone who got revenge, but as a woman who learned that the other woman is not always who you've been taught to blame, it's this. When you're betrayed, the easiest target is the other person in the affair. Because hating her is simple and hating the situation is hard. But sometimes she was lied to as thoroughly as you were. Sometimes the most powerful, most healing, most devastating to him thing you can do is to refuse the role of rivals you were both assigned and simply tell each other the truth. Liars survive on keeping people apart. Truth survives on bringing them together. Remember that, because it is the master key to every double life ever lived. Choose the truth, even when it would be so much more satisfying to choose the war. War feels like power. Truth is power. They are not the same thing, and the difference between them is the whole reason I walked away whole and he walked away with nothing. The people who deceive you are counting on you to fight the wrong person. Don't give them that. There's one more thing, though. About 6 months after the divorce, Emily called me with something she'd discovered, that I was not the first wife, and she was not the first next chapter. There had been a pattern going back years with other women in other cities. What we uncovered about exactly how long Scott had been running this. And what the two of us decided to do once we realized how many others might still be in the fog is a story entirely its own. And it might just be the most satisfying one yet. It's right there on your screen. You are going to want to see how that one ends.